Why do most Europeans and Indians speak the same language family? There really is no such thing as an indigenous people, since every tribe originated from somewhere else, and people don't spontaneously spawn out of the ground. The shared heritage between Europeans, Iranians, Pakistanis, and Indians doesn't have to be shunned or embraced, but it's very fascinating to see the linguistic, cultural, religious, and yes, even genetic connections between them through the migration of the ancient Aryans. The genetic and cultural situation of South Asia is so much more complicated than simply North versus South, and the history is also much more nuanced than simply Indo-Aryan versus Dravidian, as differences in religion, caste, language, geography, and socioeconomic status have all had an impact on the average gene pools and cultures for various South Asian groups, with the ancestral components being incredibly diverse to say the least. But in the past, it was long debated as to where exactly the two major ethno-linguistic groups in South Asia came from, with the term Aryan actually originally simply referring to the higher caste in the Hindu Varna system. The term Aryan, at its loosest definition, can be interpreted to refer to all Proto-Indo-Europeans, or PIE, a group that has its oldest attested origins on the steppes of Eurasia, although this is more of a European perspective, as the true origin of the word lies more specifically with the Proto-Indo-Iranians, a distinct yet rather diverse branch of the PIE who traveled southeast into parts unknown. The massive spread for South Asians, as seen in genetic distance principal component analysis charts, is of course due to the very diverse assortment of ancestries that have fused into one over thousands of years, and although an area like Europe is also the result of various waves of migration over time, the original components were already fairly close genetically, while in South Asia we're talking about highly diverse phenotypes, gene pools, and languages who would have seemed virtually alien to one another upon first contact. There's much debate about this to the present day, but the original genetic base of the Aryans was likely derived from the same steppe pastoralist component related to the Yamnaya that entered Europe to give birth to the modern European ethno-linguistic groups, although the Aryans in their conquest through Central Asia also picked up ancestry from the natives, being not at all too dissimilar to the latter Scythians, Bactrians, or Tocharians. These Proto-Aryans were an extremely aggressive and expansionist bunch during their trek south, which explains the uniformity of maternal DNA among Indo-Aryans today, having belonged to the same South Asian source for thousands of years, but also explains the dominance of paternal haplogroup R1a permeating much of northwest India, especially among the upper castes, which curiously enough is also found in its highest rates among the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, clearly showing the close paternal connection to the PIE of these different groups. Another interesting link between these early Indo-European peoples were their religion, with countless similarities drawn between Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and the old paganistic religions of the Greeks, Norse, Slavs, and others, as keep in mind for the vast majority of human history, animistic ethno-religions were largely the norm of any particular nation or tribe, and hence closely related people from a genealogical viewpoint very often had similar or identical religious beliefs, and usually spread mostly through conquest and subjugation rather than cultural diffusion. In the past 10,000 years, South Asia has been greatly shaped by around 4 major separate waves of migration from different ethno-linguistic groups, who, in addition to the indigenous inhabitants, have greatly impacted and penetrated nearly all corners of this region and contributed to the South Asian gene pool and phenotype, which, as you could guess, is extremely diverse, possibly the most diverse of any area of the planet. The oldest component in South Asia, branded the indigenous South Asian hunter-gatherers, considered by all to be the indigenous people of this region, is found at the highest rates among Adivasi tribals of south-central India and the Veda tribes of Sri Lanka, and nearly all have lost their original languages, although the Vedas still speak a dialect with clear pre-Dravidian and pre-Indo-Aryan roots. The next component to impact the subcontinent would be the migration of the ancient Iranian farmers from Western Asia around 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, and this is clearly the migration of the Proto-Dravidian peoples from the Middle East, hypothesized but not confirmed to be related to other ancient peoples such as the Elamites or Sumerians, and this Dravidian component is present in literally all groups and has diverged significantly from its source. The migration of the Aryans was responsible for the downfall and destruction of the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization and resulted in the southern push of the Dravidians, and contrary to there being some big replacement event, there was heavy intermixing, explaining how such a relatively small group could have permeated through such a vast civilization. Although not a single wave, various migrations from East and Southeast Asia have also had a considerable impact on the subcontinent, particularly in the north and northeastern portions, with the migration of a plethora of Thai, Austroasiatic, and Tibeto-Burman groups, some of whom have been assimilated into later South Asian peoples, while others still remain very independent to this day. For instance, the Mundari peoples are an Austroasiatic speaking group in eastern India and Bangladesh, who, by appearance alone, would appear to have very little in common with other Austroasiatic groups like the Vietnamese or Cambodians, but they're actually the result of a small, mostly male migration to ancient South Asia, where they intermixed with the indigenous tribal groups, and today they only have around 20 to 30% of their original Austroasiatic ancestry. The fourth wave of migration I described in my genomic component chart as later Middle Eastern or Islamic, and even though it is heavily tied to the Islamic invasion of the Indian subcontinent and is strongly correlated with Muslim groups in India today, this would also include the migration of many other peoples from Southwest Asia in the past couple thousand years, such as the Syriac Malabar Christians, the Parsis, Cochin Jews, and pre-Islamic Arabs, Iranians, and Afghans. In Indo-Aryan speaking groups of Pakistan and among the Islamic Aryans of northwest India, the recent Southwest Eurasian component is higher than their neighbors, but they still cluster more heavily with the pre-invasion South Asians of mixed Vedoid, Dravidian, and Aryan descent. In the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the native Andamanese are the only group with virtually no Western Eurasian admixture, and their ancestral component is more closely related to Oceanian Australoids rather than the Vedoids of the mainland. There's also been minor incursions of recent European ancestry from merchants, sailors, and soldiers during the colonial period who were from literally all parts of Western Europe, with the Portuguese being some of the earliest to establish settlements in South Asia, although not everyone with the Portuguese surname in India actually has Portuguese ancestry, as the bulk, such as the Goan Catholics, are actually the result of mass conversions of local Brahmins who were given Portuguese surnames upon baptism. Lastly, there's also a small African component in certain ethnic groups from the Indian Ocean slave trade facilitated by the Arabs and Portuguese, with the bulk of slaves arriving from Southeast Africa, with African populations like the Sidis having major South Asian admixture as well, similar to the Anglo-Indians. Ironically, the Western Eurasian-derived Dravidian genetic component that arrived roughly 6,000 years ago is currently higher in northern India among most of the Indo-Aryan-speaking ethnic groups than among the actual Dravidians of the south, actually being highest in the Gujaratis, which is why you'll often see them used as a proxy for South Asian ancestry in genetic studies, as this area was not very heavily impacted genetically by the Aryan migration, while the highest Vedoid component of any ethnic group is in the Adivasis, specifically in the Paniya, a scheduled tribe of southern India speaking a language distant related to Malayalam. Therefore, non-tribal Dravidian populations actually share more ancestry with those in the north than they do with the isolated Adivasis, and South Indian Brahmins are actually much more genetically similar to northern Indic speakers rather than the other natives around them, having a lower Vedoid and higher Aryan component, and this has long been noted by Western and Indian scholars, even long before genetic technology. The highest degree of Aryan or steppe Indo-European pastoralist ancestry in the subcontinent is generally relegated to northern Indo-Aryan populations, and although there are no ancient samples of Aryan DNA to reference, the closest living population today to the original Proto-Aryan migrants into South Asia are likely the Dardic Nuristani peoples who have lived on the eastern side of the Hindu Kush Mountains, isolated from many of the migrations and intermixings with other Indian peoples. Here's a chart of South Asian ethnic groups broken down by these genetic components that we defined earlier, and there's obviously a very high degree of overlap between different regions, making this rather hard to understand for some. So by breaking it down by ethno-linguistic categorization, we can see that Iranic and Dardic speaking groups have a moderate to high Aryan component, with groups like the Persians being closer to the Middle East, while Kashmiris are inching more towards South Asia. The Aryan component in Indo-Aryan peoples is not nearly as high as one may think. averaging only 10 to 15% for most groups, showing that the bulk of the South Asian gene pool was retained even after the Aryan migration. And when moving on to the Dravidian populations, it becomes clear that even groups like the Tamils have a small amount of Aryan blood from intermixing with the Northerners. So you could say that South Asia, just like almost every other region of the planet, is a complex mixture of many different people groups from various waves of migration, but what truly makes it unique is just the unbelievable diverse magnitude of their ancestors. Some of their forefathers in the Northeast would have been quite similar to the Tibetans or other East Asians. The original Dravidians would have resembled Iranians or other Middle Easterners, and the Aryans would have been not too dissimilar from modern-day Europeans, as hard as that is to believe, and this vast diversity of genetics, language, religion, and culture makes South Asia one of my favorite regions of the world to study. It's unfortunate that this has become such a controversial subject, even though I do understand the reasons behind it. The shared heritage between Europeans, Iranians, Pakistanis, and Indians doesn't have to be shunned or embraced, but it's very fascinating to see the linguistic, cultural, religious, and yes, even genetic connections between them through the migration of the ancient Aryans.